The rain hadn't stopped for 3 days, and still the ground smoked. Staff Sergeant Malloy sat inside the steel belly of his Sherman crocodile, listening to the drip of water on metal, waiting for the order. Outside, the Japanese laughed through loudspeakers, mocking the cowards in tanks who burned from afar. But Malloy had seen what fire did to a man's courage. He looked through the narrow slit, saw flashes in the dark, shapes moving, voices chanting. The jungle was alive with ghosts and gasoline. Over the radio, Captain Reeves' voice cracked. "Light them!" Malloy pressed the lever. A roar like a hurricane erupted, orange and alive. The night became day. Screams rose from the bunkers. Not words, just sound, Joe whispered. "They thought we were cowards." Malloy stared at the inferno swallowing the hill and muttered, "No one laughs in fire." When the flames died, silence returned. A silence too clean, too final. And in that silence came the question that would never leave him. Who burned first? Them or us? The jungle after fire was quiet, like an animal that had stopped breathing. The smell of burnt oil and wet earth mixed into a taste you couldn't wash away. Malloy climbed out of the tank at dawn, boots sinking in the mud where men used to be. The air shimmered with heat, and the sun broke through in broken beams, touching the wreckage like it pitied it. Joe followed behind, his face pale, whispering something about home. Malloy didn't answer. He looked toward the hill where Takeda's bunkers once stood and saw movement. A figure dragging another body from the ashes. He raised his rifle but hesitated. It wasn't a soldier. It was Takeda himself, barely standing, dragging a comrade through smoke. Their eyes met across the distance. One man who delivered the fire, one who survived it. For a second, neither moved. The war had gone quiet, but something else had started. Something colder than flame. By afternoon, engineers moved in to clear the wrecks. Malloy sat on the hull, eating from a tin, watching corpses being buried in silence. Joe tried to make a joke, but the words died halfway. Reeves walked up, face shadowed under his helmet. "Command wants us to push east. There's another line of bunkers near the ridge." Malloy stared at him. "We just erased a hill." Reeves nodded. "They've got 100 more." He walked off, leaving the words hanging like smoke. Joe kicked at the mud. "You think they still laugh at us?" Malloy looked toward the ridge, where new trenches waited unseen. "If they do," he said quietly, "they won't tomorrow." But deep inside, he wondered if victory still meant anything when everything they touched burned. Night returned heavy and wet. Malloy couldn't sleep inside the tank. Too hot, too close. He walked out alone, boots sinking into the mire, and stopped near what used to be an enemy bunker. There he found Takeda's headband, half burned, tied around a piece of twisted metal. He picked it up, staring at the faint characters still visible. Honor and death. The words felt wrong now, meaningless after so much fire. In the distance, a faint voice carried through the smoke. Japanese. Tired. Almost human. Malloy listened without raising his weapon. He wondered if Takeda still lived, somewhere beneath that ash, waiting for another dawn neither side deserved. The rain began again, washing the soot from his hands, but not the guilt. Before sunrise, the next push began. Engines growled awake, and the tanks lined up like beasts waiting for release. Malloy slid back into his seat, eyes hollow but steady. Joe sat beside him, whispering a prayer. Through the vision slit, Malloy could see Reeves signaling ahead. The ridge loomed like a dark scar on the land. As the tanks moved, he felt the same weight, not of fear, but of knowing what his fire would do again. Somewhere beyond that ridge, Takeda gathered the remnants of his men, preparing to die with what pride was left. The two forces, each broken in their own way, moved closer under the same rising sun. The radio crackled. "Burner, ready?" Malloy answered quietly. "Always." And as his finger touched the lever, he thought, maybe this is what hell looks like when it finally finds its home on Earth. The ridge was more fortress than Earth. Carved tunnels, hidden guns, and men who had already decided they would die there. Malloy's tank crawled forward, gears grinding through the mud, the morning mist curling around them like breath. The radio hissed with static and fear. Then came the first shell. It hit the lead tank, blowing it open like a can of steel. Joe screamed, ducking instinctively. Reeves' voice cut through the chaos. Flanks. Move. Keep pressure. Malloy swung the turret toward the flash, finger trembling over the trigger. Inside those tunnels, Takeda shouted orders, his voice breaking through smoke. Hold positions! They burn us! We burn them! Both men fought without faces, only voices echoing through smoke and thunder. Malloy fired. Fire meeting fire. The ridge erupted. In that moment, war became nothing but heat, mud, and the sound of men burning the sky. Hours dragged like years. The tanks pushed forward, inch by inch over what was left of the hill. Malloy could barely see. Mud caked the vision's slit, and the smell of burning fuel filled his lungs. Over the radio came voices he didn't recognize, men screaming, then static. Joe loaded another burst, hands shaking so hard the shells clattered. We're pushing ghosts, he muttered. Malloy didn't answer. He knew the bunkers were collapsing, but he also knew something worse. Some of the Japanese hadn't retreated. They stayed underground, waiting, refusing to yield. Every flame he sent down a tunnel was another heartbeat lost on both sides. Somewhere deep beneath the ridge, Takeda listened to the roar above and whispered a single prayer. Not for victory, but for the courage to die right. By midday, the ridge was a crater. The air shimmered with heat and grief. Malloy climbed out to guide infantry through the ruins. But what he found weren't bunkers anymore, just holes in the ground filled with silence. He lowered his rifle. Inside one tunnel lay Takeda's flag, untouched, its red circle unburned amid black ash. Joe stepped beside him, whispering, "Guess we got them." Malloy shook his head. "Nobody gets anyone out here." As he turned away, a shot cracked. Joe stumbled back, a red bloom spreading across his chest. Malloy caught him before he fell. From the smoke, a wounded Japanese soldier dropped his rifle, realizing too late what he'd done. Malloy's eyes met his, not with hate, but with emptiness. The world held its breath again. Joe's death spread through the company like a shadow. Reeves ordered the line forward, but the fire in the men had dimmed. Malloy didn't speak. He just drove. Every sound, the tank's rumble, the hiss of the flamethrower, reminded him of the boy's last breath. When they reached the next ridge, the radio crackled again, this time with Japanese. Static mixed with a calm voice. "Takeda's." Malloy froze, listening as a translator whispered, "He says he's still alive. He wants to speak to the one who burns." For a long time, Malloy said nothing. Then he pressed the button and answered in a low, tired voice. "I'm listening." The jungle wind carried their silence. Two men who'd met only through flame. Twilight fell, turning the battlefield bronze. Through broken radio channels, Takeda's voice came again. Not angry, not desperate. "You fight with fire. We fight with faith. Both burn." Malloy closed his eyes, the sound of that calm voice echoing through static and memory. "You could surrender," he said quietly. A pause, then Takeda's reply. "And live in shame? No, but maybe. I can die without hate." The radio went silent. Malloy sat back, staring at the last rays of sunlight painting the tank's metal gold. Somewhere across the ridge, a single explosion bloomed. Quiet, final, and bright. He knew what it meant. The enemy hadn't surrendered. They'd ended themselves. He whispered into the empty radio. Maybe that's the only peace left. The ridge was silent again, but silence in war never felt like peace. Malloy stood outside his tank, staring at the crater that once held Takeda's bunker. There was no body, no flag, only melted stone and the faint smell of burnt cordite. Joe's helmet hung from the barrel of the gun like a memorial. Reeves approached slowly, his voice rough from smoke. "Command says we move south by morning." Malloy didn't turn. South to what? Reeves looked past him at the smoldering hills. "Does it matter?" Malloy nodded once, eyes fixed on the horizon that seemed to burn even without flame. Deep inside, he felt something break, not from what he'd done, but from what he could no longer feel. The fire was out there no longer. It lived inside him now. They bivouacked at the edge of a ruined village that night. The men built fires, though no one wanted warmth anymore. Malloy sat apart, watching embers drift like lost souls. In the distance, the sound of frogs returned. The jungle breathing again. Reeves joined him quietly, offering a canteen. "You did your job, Frank." Malloy took it, but didn't drink. "And what was it? Burning men or saving them from themselves?" Reeves didn't answer. They both stared at the small fires flickering in the dark like tiny ghosts of everything they'd lost. Somewhere beyond the trees, lightning flashed, and for a heartbeat, Malloy thought he saw Takeda's face in the glow. Calm, unblaming, gone. He blinked. Only smoke remained. By morning, rain came again. Soft, endless, cleansing nothing. The company rolled out, engines grinding through what used to be roads. Malloy drove without a word. Every burned tree looked like a monument, every crater a grave. Along the roadside, villagers emerged from hiding, thin, barefoot, eyes empty. They didn't look at the soldiers. They looked past them, toward what used to be home. One old man bowed to Malloy's tank, not in gratitude, but surrender. Malloy wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. Joe's seat beside him was still empty, a silence heavier than armor. He realized then, even victory leaves you homeless. They stopped at a coastal outpost that afternoon, where the sea stretched endless and gray. Malloy walked to the edge of the cliff, wind whipping through his uniform. Below, the ocean churned against black rocks, the same sound, he thought, as fire against steel. Reeves came up beside him, holding an envelope. Orders came through. "You're going home, Sergeant." Malloy stared at it without taking it. "Home," he repeated, as if testing a word he'd forgotten. The sea roared back, indifferent. Reeves left the letter on the ground and walked away. Malloy stayed, watching the horizon burn gold as the sun fell. The same color as every flame he'd ever made. That night, Malloy sat alone on the beach. Waves lapped at burned debris, helmets, spent shells, wood blackened by war. He lit a cigarette with shaking hands, watching the ember glow in the wind. In its brief light, he saw faces. Joe's grin, Takeda's calm eyes, Reeves' weary stare, all of them flickering in smoke. He thought about the flame that had once been a weapon, and now was only a memory trying to stay warm. He whispered into the dark, "Woo." Burned everything, and still the cold stayed. The wind took his words and carried them out to sea. For the first time, he didn't fight it. He just watched the ember fade and the tide erase it. The ship home smelled of rust, salt, and ghosts. Malloy stood by the railing, staring at the endless water that separated two worlds, one still burning behind him, one he no longer recognized ahead. The soldiers around him laughed in low, tired voices, trading stories to forget. But Malloy stayed quiet, hands gripping the cold steel. When the sun set, the ocean reflected it like liquid fire. He looked away. Joe's voice echoed faintly in memory. Well, make it home, right, Sarge." Malloy swallowed hard. The waves rolled on, carrying men who'd survived everything but themselves. As night fell, he realized the sea wasn't taking him away from war. It was just taking him to where silence had sharper teeth. San Francisco greeted them with cheers, bands, and waving flags, but it all sounded far away. Malloy stepped off the ship and felt the concrete under his boots. Solid, unmoving, too clean. Reporters asked questions. Hands reached for handshakes, but he couldn't meet their eyes. A woman placed a flower in his hand. He stared at it like it was a piece of shrapnel. Around him, soldiers smiled for cameras. None of them smiled like they meant it. In the noise and applause, Malloy caught his reflection in a shop window. A man in uniform, alive but hollow. He turned away. War had ended. His war hat. He took a small apartment near the shipyard. Nights were long and quiet, except for the echoes that followed him home. Sometimes he'd wake in darkness, certain he smelled smoke. Once he dreamed of Takeda standing in a field of ashes, saying nothing, just looking at him as if asking for something Malloy couldn't give. The city outside kept moving, oblivious. Streetcars rattled, radios sang, and men who hadn't been there spoke proudly of victory. Malloy just stared at his hands. They were clean now, but he could still feel the heat. He began to realize some fires don't go out. They just find new places to burn. Months passed, but peace didn't come. Malloy worked at the shipyard, welding steel plates, pretending the sparks didn't look like flame. The men talked about baseball, beer, women, anything but war. He listened but rarely spoke. One evening after the whistle blew, he saw a group of kids playing by the docks, waving sticks like rifles, shouting, "Burn! He froze. The laughter hit harder than any gunfight. He turned away, but the smell of oil and heat rushed back like memory. That night, he sat on his apartment floor, the world spinning around a single thought. Maybe the fire never belonged to war at all. Maybe it lived inside people, waiting for someone to feed it. One night, he visited the veterans' bar down the street. Dim lights, old songs, and men trying to outdrink their memories. Reeves was there, older, heavier, eyes softer, but still tired. They sat in silence for a while before Reeves spoke. "You ever sleep, Frank?" Malloy smiled without humor. "Only when I don't dream." Reeves nodded. "Me too." They clinked glasses, not to celebrate, but to remember without saying it aloud. The jukebox played something gentle, something about home. Malloy stared into his glass and saw fire again. Softer this time, like it was learning to die out. For the first time, he didn't look away. The rain returned one night, hard and endless, drumming on the apartment roof like machine gun fire. Malloy couldn't sleep. He sat by the window, staring at the street below, watching reflections of car lights bleed across the glass like rivers of flame. He reached for the cigarette tin he hadn't touched since Okinawa. Inside was the half-burned headband he'd taken from the bunker. Takeda's. He held it gently. The faint Japanese characters still visible under soot. "Honor in death." He whispered the words like a prayer, though he didn't know why. Somewhere deep inside, he felt the strange pull of something unfinished, as if the fire still waited for an answer. The next morning, Malloy walked to the harbor with the headband in his pocket. The fog was thick, swallowing sound and shape. He sat at the pier, staring at the endless gray water. For a long time, he said nothing. Then, softly, he began to speak, not to anyone near, but to someone far away. "You should lived, Takeda. Maybe both of us could have." His voice trembled. "Why? I don't know if what we did was right, but I remember you. That has to count for something." He tied the headband around a rusted post, letting the wind pull its edges free. It fluttered gently, like a soul unburdened. For the first time, Malloy didn't feel alone. Just quiet. Days later, he began visiting the Veterans Hospital after work. He didn't know why at first. Maybe because it was quiet. Maybe because the smell of antiseptic reminded him of order amid chaos. He met a Japanese-American medic there named Kenji, who volunteered to help amputees. They talked over coffee one afternoon. Kenji listened more than he spoke. When Malloy finally mentioned Okinawa, Kenji just nodded. "My uncle was there," he said softly. "He didn't come home either." Malloy froze. They didn't say another word for a while. Two men from different sides, bound by the same loss. In the silence, something in Malloy's chest eased. Not healed, but softened, like steel cooling after fire. That night, Malloy dreamed again. The ridge, the fire, the voices. But this time, the flames didn't scream. They whispered. He saw Takeda, standing at the edge of the burning hill, unarmed, his uniform clean, his face calm. Malloy walked toward him through the smoke. No words were spoken. Takeda simply bowed once, slow and deep. Malloy wanted to ask why, to say sorry, to explain. But when he opened his mouth, no sound came. Takeda smiled faintly, not in forgiveness, but in peace. Then the smoke rose between them, and he was gone. Malloy woke with tears on his face and a strange warmth in his chest, the kind that didn't burn. When he awoke, the morning light filled the room, soft and golden. The rain had stopped. Malloy sat on the edge of his bed, feeling the weight in his chest lighter than it had been in years. He looked out the window at the ships moving slowly across the bay, their trails cutting calm lines through the water. The fire was finally gone, not forgotten, but no longer alive inside him. He picked up his jacket, ready for work, and paused at the door. On the table lay the cigarette tin, now empty. He smiled faintly. "Rest easy, Takeda," he whispered. Then he left, not to escape the past, but to walk beside it. Years passed like pages turned in silence. The war became something people spoke about over coffee. History, not horror. Malloy kept working at the shipyard, his hair turning gray before his heart ever did. One afternoon, a letter arrived from a local school asking him to speak to their students about the war. He almost threw it away, then paused. Maybe it was time. That night, he sat at his kitchen table, staring at the paper. The memories pressed close again. Fire. Smoke. Voices he'd tried to bury. But this time, they didn't hurt. They just waited, patient and heavy, like an old friend who wanted to be heard. The school auditorium smelled of chalk and varnish. Rows of children waited, their eyes bright with curiosity, not fear. Malloy stood behind the podium, fingers tracing the worn edge of his note cards. He didn't plan to read them. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but steady. "War isn't about heroes," he said. "It's about people, scared, brave, wrong, right, all at once." He told them about the rain, the fire, and the silence after. He didn't name enemies. He didn't name victories. When he finished, no one clapped. They just sat in silence, listening to the weight of what wasn't said. And in that silence, he felt something heal. After the assembly, a young boy approached him. Small, quiet, clutching a folded paper crane. "My grandpa fought in Japan," he said. "He didn't come home." Malloy knelt down, taking the crane gently. "Then we both remember him now," he said softly. The boy smiled, and for a fleeting second, Malloy saw Joe's grin. The same innocence untouched by war. As the boy walked away, Malloy realized memory wasn't meant to haunt. It was meant to pass on, so that someone else could carry it without burning. That evening, Malloy visited the Veterans Memorial downtown. The marble gleamed under the setting sun, names etched deep and endless. He ran his hand across the cold stone, tracing letters he didn't know but somehow understood. Each name was a voice, each silence a story. He took the paper crane from his pocket and placed it at the base of the wall. "For all of you," he whispered, "even the ones who burned." A breeze lifted through the plaza, carrying faint laughter from the city nearby, life going on, unashamed. Malloy smiled, his heart finally still. When night came, he returned home, sat by the same window where the rain once whispered, and looked out at the city lights. They flickered like distant campfires, soft and harmless. He thought of Takeda, of Joe, of Reeves. All gone, all still here somehow. The world had kept turning, but now he understood his place in it. Not as a soldier, not as a survivor, but as a keeper of truth. He reached for his notebook and began to write, his words simple and steady. The story of men who burned the world to survive and learned to live again by remembering. Outside, the night was calm. Inside, so was he. Years later, the city changed, but Malloy's small apartment stayed the same. Simple, quiet, filled with light. His notebook had grown thick, its pages worn with ink and time. People sometimes wrote to him now. Students, historians, strangers, thanking him for sharing the truth without bitterness. He never replied with long letters, only a line or two. Fire teaches us what to keep. That morning, he looked out over the bay, steam rising from his coffee, sunlight glittering on the water. He smiled faintly. The world looked softer now, and so did he. Peace, he realized, wasn't something you found. It was something you learned to stop running from. He began teaching at the Veterans Center. Small classes, mostly young men and women who'd returned from other wars. He didn't talk about strategy or medals. He talked about fear and guilt and the weight of silence. One afternoon, a young Marine asked him, "How do you stop seeing it?" Malloy paused before answering. "You don't," he said softly. "You learn to see it differently." The class went quiet, the kind of silence that listens. For the first time in his life, Malloy felt the fire in his words, not as destruction, but as light. That night, after class, he took a walk by the waterfront. The air smelled of salt and diesel, just like it did the day he came home decades ago. But now, it didn't smell like ghosts, just life. He stopped where the old pier used to stand and looked out across the black water. The rusted post was still there, and on it, weathered and frayed, the remains of Takeda's headband fluttered weakly in the wind. He smiled, touched it gently, and whispered, "Still here, huh?" For a moment he thought he heard a voice in the wind, not words, just calm. He bowed his head the same way Takeda had, and walked away. Malloy's health began to fade quietly, like smoke after rain. The doctor told him his heart was weak. He nodded, almost smiling. Guess it carried too much heat. He spent his days writing letters, reading old notes, watching the sun move across his window. One afternoon, as the light dimmed, he picked up Joe's photo. 2 boys in uniform, smiling like they hadn't met the world yet. "We made it, kid," he whispered. Then he leaned back in his chair, eyes closing softly. The last thing he saw was light. Not flame, not pain, just light. At the Veterans Center a week later, they held a small memorial. No speeches, no ranks, just quiet faces and a folded flag. Kenji, older now, placed Malloy's notebook on the podium and read his final line aloud. "If war teaches anything, it's that fire destroys what we love, and what survives is what was worth loving in the first place." Outside, the rain began to fall, gentle and steady, like an old song returning. Somewhere across the ocean, a headband fluttered on a rusted post, catching the rain, carrying 2 names the world had forgotten. But the sea never would.